How do you think Hughes would feel about how Black art and Black artists are incorporated into America today and perceived by the rest of America? Would he be happy with how it's developed, or what do you think?
I mean, I think one thing is like I think he'd be pretty happy with how there's a lot more kind of Black creators that are creating art in genres that we otherwise haven't associated with them. So I'm like thinking of things like Lovecraft Country, right, and like the fact, or like Get Out, right, like kind of movies that are in horror or in sci-fi or in fantasy, things that otherwise we often don't associate with Black authors. Even though there's been a lot of excellent Black sci-fi authors, there often aren't taught. So I think that one thing he would be happy about is that full humanity that we're getting to kind of see Black art outside of only talking about, and these things are often very clear in their politics. They really want to think through a lot of important issues about what is a good society, what is justice, right? What, what about autonomy, but they do it in ways that are really thoughtful and experimental, and that aren't ways that we imagine Black art are supposed to look like. So I think that he'd be really happy in a certain way, but I think that he would also, I think that what makes this such a good manifesto to even teach now is how many some of the same problems that exist, how people will be like really upset about how certain characters are portrayed because they feel so stereotypical, because there still isn't enough representation of Black people in a lot of arts, right? So I think that he would still say that there's like some obstacles out there, but I think he'd be happy with seeing some of the things that are happening that allow, that are making it so Black artists are appearing in genres that weren't really being seen in the 1920s that way.
Progress, but not there yet. Excuse me. I have a question from Andrea about who this material could be geared towards. Is it okay to teach this to freshmen or more so juniors and seniors? Especially curious about students writing this mainly in connections towards the past and present for racial and political issues.
I mean, I think, it's hard to say. I mean, I always I can always understand, like when I said, when I taught ninth grade, it was just like, there are things that you think that you can teach them and it's not going to go as well. I actually think this is a fairly, because it's short, it's really easy to like go through paragraph by paragraph with the students and making sure they kind of understand each point. So I do think that this is something like, I think if you were doing it with like juniors and seniors, you might even do it alongside some other kind of Black Lives Matters manifestos that have come out about things, right? Or Black artists who are trying to talk about these issues today. But I do think that you could do it alongside this. I might instead teach something like one of the simple stories like Banquet and Honor, because it's actually super easy to understand, but it comes up with some of the same issues around like white gatekeeping and issues of like appreciation in the community, and what does it mean to be an artist if nobody's buying your stuff, right? That would, I think, would be interesting and much easier for them to understand. But it is a fairly short piece, and so it's, what I like about it is that you could read it in a classroom together. Like you wouldn't have to have anybody take it home and read it beforehand. Like you could like read it together and really break it down paragraph by paragraph. I don't know if that helps with your question.
Makes sense to me. Question. Oh, the sun is hitting my camera.
You're invisible now. The invisible man.
Question from James. Do you know what his religious background was?
That's a good question. Off the top of my head right now, I'm having a hard time remembering it. I mean, I don't think that as an adult he had much strong pull to religion. I know that there's been a lot of discussion that he was likely a closeted gay man, and that and while there's been discussion among scholars about how strong that, whether or not he was maybe even asexual and just didn't really even have relationships, there was definitely like indicators that he wasn't as comfortable in like religious communities as an adult. I don't know as if he was growing up, he was raised in a particular religious background though.
Okay, we can do some independent research.
Thank you.
Question a while back from Morgan. Did Hughes have a feud with Claude McKay?
He had fused with a lot of people, and especially with his patron, the first patron he had, which I'm for some reason her name is going off of my tongue right now. It's not in my head. But like his first patron, he had like he had this love-hate relationship with, and he definitely had feuds with different members of the Harlem Renaissance. I mean, I don't know about exactly Claude McKay, but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, Claude McKay is also a really important figure, but he was also Caribbean, right? And so he definitely had some different views, and there often has been kind of feuding between kind of Black Caribbeans and kind of Black Americans, particularly when it comes to thinking through racial justice in America. So I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know exactly. It would be something I'd have to look up.
Okay. And I think those are all the questions. Oh, here we go. Would the feuds be a good angle to teach Hughes from? Follow up on work.
So one thing I like to do is instead of thinking of it necessarily always as feuds, I really do like to put it as as more like being in conversation. Because one thing I like about this piece and why I also always teach it in line with George Schuyler, and George Schuyler had a feud with everybody. He became less and less popular. He was basically all the Black people stopped talking to George Schuyler by the time he was dead because he was very contrarian. And he was the person that wrote this initial thing, and he became like, very just kind of very, very conservative, John Birch Society conservative by the end of his life. But I do like to always tell my students that like all of these writers were in conversation. They knew each other. They were often responding to each other. There was always some sense that they knew about what other people were doing. And that's why I like to point out the County Cullen, because County Cullen and him had very different ideas about what art was supposed to be like, a much more traditional versus a much more working class idea. And obviously they respected each other, but they were always kind of thinking, they were always in conversation, right? And because other people were putting them in conversation, and because they were doing it too. And it's something that you can do anytime you're talking about in general Black artists. There's a lot, there's some really good poems by Langston Hughes that are about Booker T. Washington, and that where he was asked to write for Booker T. Washington, and ones he just wrote because of him. And so it's really interesting if you want to compare and contrast different kind of Black American thinkers. It's really easy to do so because actually they so frequently are so aware of each other's work in a way that I kind of wish more white American authors did, just because it's so easy to put them in conversation. So I don't always do it as feuds, just because I also like when I teach Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., I don't teach that as a feud either, because it's surprising how much they kind of shared in common. But I do want them to also know that they had very different ideas about how they were going to get to a certain place, right? And I don't want to think that they both wanted the same thing, right? They wanted freedom for Black Americans, and they both really thought the other people were trying to do the best they could, right? They just disagreed. So I do think it can be cool to set it up as like these people are in conversation, just because it also shows that like so frequently Black Americans are put forward as having one opinion, and we can really just say this is what Black art is, or this is what Black people thought. But it's not true at all, right? Like we can look at all of these pieces of art and even these manifestos and see like, wow, there's so much diversity, just like there is among any other group in America, right? So I would say I wouldn't necessarily put it as a feud, but I definitely love putting people in conversation, because then it feels more like real, like, hey, these people didn't just write this for nobody. People were reading this, right? People were caring about this way.
Wonderful. And along that same vein, we have a question from Eric about pairing Hughes with Zora Neale Hurston. If you would use the two of them represent different aspects of the Harlem Renaissance, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, you can also have them, they share in some ways how important it was to look at the lowdown folks, right? As was put down. Zora Neale Hurston was like a folklorist and anthropologist. So she wrote a lot about, she basically tried to really keep records of Black Americans who had been enslaved. In fact, I think there's a recent book that came out that was like her interview, or based on like her interviews with one of the last enslaved people. I think it's called Barracuda. And so it's really interesting that she really cared about getting the voices of people who were at the most oppressed and marginalized in the lower class, people who had folk cultures that were kind of being eradicated. She really cared about that. So I think that'd be interesting because they did it in really different ways, but they both cared very much about like saw the lower class as like really having this rich artistic and cultural history that had to be maintained. So I think it would be super interesting because she also wrote a lot, and she has, you know, she wrote kind of one of the first studies on voodoo, and so it'd be really interesting to kind of compare her writing style, and how she decided to kind of tackle the kind of working class as the kind of the main way of thinking about Black American cultural production alongside like Hughes's, because they have very different styles.
Wonderful. And so thanks, Eric, for sharing that. We have one last question, and maybe you can answer quickly or type it into your chat function. But we need to get on to the next. This is just a question from Jamie asking if you could recommend any more BIPOC voices of this time to bring into the AP Lang classroom. So additional resources. Great question.
One thing that I like to teach students is that the kind of Harlem Renaissance is often imagined as kind of a U.S. phenomenon, but there were actually a lot of Black Caribbean writers who were also there. Claude McKay was mentioned. I like to teach Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. He's often talked about as a really important Harlem Renaissance figure, and he is, because he created it's now known as the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York City, but it was basically the largest collection of global kind of Black diaspora artifacts. And he was super important, but he's Afro-Puerto Rican. And what I like about talking about him is that you get to he wrote a lot of biographies of people that were important Black figures throughout the world, like in Spain and in Panama and in a lot of places. But he was writing in the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of these works. And he is probably one of the first people to write a speech in which he argued for a chair of Black history in our schools. And so he's a really important figure I like to have them read about, because we often don't think about the fact that like in this time, Puerto Rico was just becoming a state, not a state, sorry, was just becoming a US territory that had citizenship, right? And this has real importance to nowadays. In kind of thinking about, he was living through the fact that like he was now a US citizen, which is not something you'd ever expected, right? But also he wanted to kind of create this like Pan-African idea of like what Black art looked like across the globe. And so I do usually talk about him as well, since a lot of times we don't include people who are kind of Afro-Latino in this our Harlem Renaissance history, but there actually were a few, but there's a lot of other people. And in fact, I'd be happy to send in other suggestions of people that you could look at for the Harlem Renaissance, because it was a wide ranging movement.
That'd be great. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind throwing it in the chat or sending me that list, that'd be amazing. I'm sure everyone would appreciate it. So that is all the time we have for the Q&A.